Now we'll go to our next presentation. Our next speaker is we'll be talking about the experiences of Filipino-Americans in navigating pathways into STEM and healthcare careers. Our speaker is Dr. Krystie Palma Cobian. Dr. Cobian is a senior research analyst at the Coordination Center for the Diversity Program Consortium, funded by National Institutes of Health. She earned her PhD in Higher Education and Organizational Change from UCLA. Her research interests include career development and leadership opportunities for women of color, and policies and practices that impact underrepresented groups in STEM. Krystie was born and raised in Southern California and is the proud daughter of immigrant parents, including her mother who came to the US from Pangasinan. Please welcome Dr. Cobian.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for organizing this, Dr. Santo Domingo, and thank you all for being here to talk specifically about diversity in STEM. It is so integral to every scientific discipline. And so while my research focuses on underrepresented groups in STEM more broadly, today my contribution to this group discussion is to share research that seeks to complicate rather than to simplify our understanding of Filipino-Americans in particular. So this dual focus on STEM and healthcare careers that I'll be presenting about mainly sheds light on the fact that we cannot talk about Filipinos in STEM without addressing Filipinas and Filipinos in healthcare. And this conversation on diversity in STEM is particularly urgent to address, given that we're in the midst of a global pandemic where Filipino women are overrepresented in healthcare and they are disproportionately impacted as presented earlier. We're also in a period of racial reckoning where protests have shed light on how deeply embedded racism is in every aspect of US society, and that includes STEM. And so this provides an opportunity for us to pause and reflect on what has brought us here, which is framed so well by Dr. Maria Rosario Araneta. She's a professor at UC San Diego, and in the latest LA Times article said it's a colonial relationship that reinforces the US dependence on foreign labor. This was also reflected and framed so well by Drs. De Mata and Santo Domingo in the previous presentation. So I won't spend too much time on this. It's been covered a little, but what I do want to point out is the challenge of doing this work due to the lack of data on Filipinas and Filipinos in general. And we know from research that women of color are underrepresented in all STEM disciplines. And we know that they face many challenges due to compounded effects of racism and sexism in STEM, but we're still revealing and trying to understand the extent of underrepresentation, as well as the unique challenges that Filipinas face in STEM. So a few concepts to keep in mind as we look at the stories of Filipino women. First, in terms of careers, a career is not decided once. And so instead, a person makes decisions, many of them over time. And these decisions are influenced both by a person's environment, while they also have the agency to make those career decisions, right? And secondly, also talked about earlier, but there are many external factors for Filipino women. In particular, what kept coming up from the data as I was analyzing it was the continued impacts of colonialism, the impacts of migration patterns, the impacts of internalizing beliefs of inferiority, or Kevin Nadal's work on colonial mentality, and other Filipino scholars that have worked and studied this and added to the literature on this. And lastly, while I started this work trying to understand the unique experiences of Filipino-American women, I realized that making sense of what was happening was not just about these women, but it was really about understanding the Filipino women experience their career journeys differently from white women and differently from Filipino men. There's something unique there, but it's not about them. It's about the systems of power, the interlocking systems, how policies and practices have shaped the outcomes that we're now seeing today. So very briefly, who is interviewed in this study is a qualitative study. Normally my work is quantitative, but we have a a group of women that came from a larger subset of women of color in STEM and healthcare. They're all in their late 20s or early 30s at the time of the interview, and they were all born in the US and or arrived at a very young age. And so I suspect that these themes would be very different if the interviews analyzed focus on a different age group, if they focused on maybe my another generation of the first generation that came here and their experiences immigrating and all the identities that they would hold. However, I think this group is of great interest because as a child of immigrants myself, with parents that made sacrifices to be here, I wanted to focus on this group to understand what happens to the second generation, which we know from research that the second generation does not end up in STEM careers at the same level of their Asian immigrant parents. So to introduce the group of women, this is them. One thing to keep in mind is that these are women who are success stories. I was trying to understand what makes you go into STEM, and they made it into STEM or to healthcare. I list their reported family income, and then I also list through the course of the interviews that they talked about what their parents did for a living. And so we can assume a lot of them are having parents that match the immigration patterns from 1965 and onward of a lot of people with educations or professions in STEM or in healthcare. And then we also see some patterns in where they ended up at the time of the interview. So we have some engineers, some healthcare professionals, and a couple of the PAASE doing data and tech. There are no STEM academics, no chemists, no biologists. So it really looks like TEM instead of STEM right now, but even this shows us some data or some patterns that are occurring. So I realized quickly I was analyzing their stories. As I was analyzing their stories, I could not make sense of their individual experiences alone without placing into context the bigger picture of colonialism. So as a brief explainer to the next slides with the stories, historicity, when I refer to that, it's the broad interlocking systems of economic, legal, political, media, and social power and classification that have evolved over time in specific places. And they shape what the participants experience on this individual level as they start to make meaning of their own career stories. Some of you may be familiar with Joe Coy. I watched some of his specials, but this next slide kind of leads to what he talks about in his comedy of what is kind of embedded in Filipino culture. And so for Emily, again, we cannot talk about STEM unless we talk about healthcare. So this quote from her, she became a nurse and experientially she reflected on her mother's influence. Her mom was also a nurse. And she decided that, my mom marketed it like it was nobody's business. If you take this job, you can go anywhere in the world. You'll always have a job. And she realized that, this could work for her too. She saw that it provided financial stability. It related to her interests in science enough, but it can make us wonder, what if she could have seen herself in another profession? What if her family wasn't so worried about financial stability? And then considering historicity, Catherine Sinisa Choi's book was mentioned earlier, Empire of Care. She traces migration policies and the ways that the US was very intentional in using Filipino bodies to fill the nursing shortage in the US. So this then shapes the messages that the next generation gets about what kind of careers can you see for yourself. So this quote, some background from Camille, who ended up in the tech sector, is that she realized at her job that they were creating chatbots, and this was saving the company money instead of having call centers with live people to chat with customers. So because these chatbots could do the work instead. So on an experiential level, Camille was making connections to her experiences from her great-grandmother's story in Bataan, when she had just learned about. And this was a turning point for Camille. She decided, this affected her so much, she decided to move to the Philippines and use her experience in tech to develop jobs there, because she was just so moved by her own ancestral history of her great-grandmother, coupled with the pattern of the US looking for ways to find cheap labor and typically relying on the Philippines to fill those labor needs. with respect to the call centers. And then before speaking about Stacy's story, Stacy ended up as a physical therapist. I want to remind you that while she made it into a medical field, so she's kind of a success in making it into healthcare, she and the other participants faced several obstacles. So Stacy was a salutatorian in her high school, but she went to a large, highly selective public university. We know what these places are like. They have large classes, sometimes often actually in STEM, you get graded on a curve. And so you might end up with a C in the class because only so many people can pass the course. So she was struggling to earn top grades in these courses. And although most people struggle in these courses, her own struggles tied with the simultaneous gendered and cultural socialization to internalize shame, and you have a recipe for disaster. She blamed herself often, and she experienced a great deal of mental health challenges that she talked about later in her story. And as a higher ed scholar, I can tell you that it should have been the colleges and universities shifting the responsibility onto themselves to provide additional resources, change up their teaching practices, and address how isolating these courses can be, especially for women of color. And now moving to Leilani, who ended up in aerospace engineering. So here's a success story. However, when I asked how she ended up where she did, she says she came from a family with less resources, but she attributes her pathway really to luck in some ways, because someone at her church paid for her to go to a small private school where she was able to get a great education, particularly in math. So by the time she got to high school, interestingly, she was already aware of stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and the underrepresentation of women in math, yet was also protected a little bit from these impacts due to support from her teachers. So briefly, I wish I had more time, but as a higher ed scholar, I also had to know what specifically in college contributed to their career decisions. And so I've broken it down into what helped them, what hindered them, and a bit of what's complicated. What helped and what did not help, these are common in the research. So we know these things. Other research studies talk about this a lot more and prove this. But what's complicated, being involved in Filipino organizations, it's interesting that that's the thing that made many of them feel a sense of belonging and that got them through college, but was also the thing that they looked back on and said it took a lot of their time, possibly time away from studying. And so it made me wonder, well, why do other students get to feel like they belong so easily in college without having to spend so much time and energy achieving this sense of belonging as just to survive college? Majority students get to study science, while Filipino students are running around and fighting for Filipino studies, organizing tutoring and retention projects for their communities, writing and performing the cultural nights, getting justice for Filipino veterans, all while trying to also just study science. Scholar Sedale Melacus talks about this as the inclusion tax, the toll that you pay just to belong. So overall, we know, especially now, that we cannot just keep up with diversity 101 sorts of efforts. That suggests in some ways that Filipinos just need to keep being resilient as possible and suck it up and do everything they need to do to continue on and get to their STEM career. There are so many external factors that shape their career decisions, many of which involve interlocking systems of power, being socialized as women, dealing with all the stereotypes of what it means to be an Asian woman in STEM, and the added layer of policies and migration patterns that shape career pressures to find stability in the US. So what does all of this mean? First, we are slowly developing more information regarding the intersections of identity, so that's good, and we should keep doing this. Second, we need to go further and further disaggregate data to understand what's really happening and put resources where they need to go in order to achieve equity. As Attorney General for Cook County in Illinois, Kim Fox, said recently in a podcast episode, you cannot fix what you can't measure. And so her goal was to show all of the data that they have from the Attorney General's office so that people could do this research. And we need to figure out how to do the same for STEM. Third, we need to educate ourselves, our colleagues, those in power about structural oppression. We cannot solve problems by continuing to place the onus on Filipino women or Filipinos in general in order to get them to STEM careers. And lastly, we need to do what our ancestors have always known how to do, how to fight, how to advocate for action, whether that be advocating for our own colleges and universities to provide data on Filipinas, Filipinos, or advocating for visibility of Filipinos in research and in policy. And so as scientists of Filipino descent, scientists and social scientists, we must use science to accurately uncover the truth behind disparities that we're seeing in STEM and use science to create change so that we can bring our full selves as a Filipino community into these STEM fields. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cobian, for such an illuminating presentation. I would like to remind our audience, both on Zoom and YouTube, to write your questions using the chat or comment box, which we'll try to answer after the next presentation. We already received one or two questions.